Bismillah. If I say anything that brings you any benefit or good, then this is from Allah. And if I say something that is wrong, then it is from my own mistakes and shortcomings. The shadow is the psychological container for what we are not relating to consciously. I repeat, the shadow is a container for what we are not relating to consciously. And it needs no hype man to be introduced. Its mysteries and lore precede it. What I want to offer you is a grounded and practical way of seeing it so you can make sense of its meaning in your own life and learn how its shape shifts depending upon what light and whose light is shining. For the most part, we are going to be discussing what the shadow is and how it operates in regard to the darkness of our unconscious. However, first we need to talk about what it is not. The shadow itself is not evil, however tempting it may be to believe that. Evil doesn't come from an instinct or impulse, it is born out of deception. It comes from believing a lie and choosing to enact it through conscious choice. There is a difference in the types of moral failure here. On the one hand, plenty of harm can be brought into the world from our shadow, but pure evil is enacted with conscious awareness. The fact that it is conscious disqualifies it from being part of the shadow. Satan himself is condemned not for his nature, but for conscious disobedience. As an example, we have two different types of crime for killing someone, right? Murder and manslaughter. One is a chosen act, the other is harm arising from a lack of faculty. Now you might be thinking, what happens when wrongdoing becomes automatic? You know how you can get so good at something you no longer have to put effort into thinking about it. So this will probably clarify it for you. Repeated conscious choices eventually habituate. A compulsive liar isn't unconsciously innocent. He practiced the lie over and over again until the moral strain dulled and the behavior felt natural. That doesn't make the act unconscious. It just means he trained himself past the discomfort. It's the outcome of habituated deception. Now let's get back to what the shadow is not. We can take this one step further. Not only is the shadow not bad, it's not good either. It's a morally neutral non-entity that contains unconscious material. The insight that comes from it can be used to nurture or poison depending upon how it's wielded. So if it's not good or bad, then how does it become our shadow? Society, culture, organizations, and even your family of origin operate in a collective way which pressures people to define certain behaviors as acceptable or unacceptable, regardless of the instinct and drive behind it. As an example, let's look at a child. We'll call her Susie, and she is naturally assertive. While playing with dolls, she directs everyone else on what to say and how to play, like a little Spielberg. But instead of being praised for her leadership drive, she's called bossy. So she tucks her assertiveness out of sight into the shadow like a well-kept secret and becomes nice. The kind of nice that gets her walked over and makes her think maybe it wouldn't be so bad moving to a secluded island with bad reception. You know those memes that say, live here for 1 year alone and get $1 million? Susie sees that and thinks, I'd do it for free. Just throw in a blanket and a coffee machine. No shadow hides things forever. Unbeknownst to her, her shadow follows her around, even precedes her. Since she can't overtly tell others what to do, because that is unacceptable, Susie convinces herself that she is simply doing things the right way. Not because she wants control, but because it's how things should be. This way, she never has to confront anyone directly. The influence from her shadow quietly begins to control the environment through rules, expectations, and unspoken shoulds. What could have been nurtured into leadership skills becomes repressed and indirect. Her ought-to principles help her maintain a society-proof detachment from being accused of trying to tell people what to do. And Susie's just one example. We all have our own version of repressed assertiveness, or whatever trait we've buried so deep that we can barely remember it was ever related to us. But don't worry, it remembers you, and it wants to come out and play. So let's begin. It's time to go into the deep, dark forest. because the forest is the realm of the unconscious. It's the place where our shadow resides, and what we find there depends on how honest we're willing to be. It is no ordinary place. It's where the path disappears, where the compass breaks, and where the usual rules no longer apply. To enter it is to step outside the safety of who we think we are, our roles, our reputations, our curated selves, and into something older, stranger, and far less polite. This is the threshold where instincts return, symbols come alive, and the whispers of the unacknowledged elements of our minds finally grow loud enough to be heard. From here, we'll be tracing the anatomy of the shadow, starting with the wall that keeps it hidden. It isn't made of stone, but it's just as real. Deep in the forest, we find a psychological dam, the repression barrier. It's what holds back the flood of everything we were told not to see or feel. All right, so here we are at the dam. But this dam, it's invisible. What we see instead is the seepage, water trickling through in some places, surging in others. Sometimes it looks manageable, sometimes it's a force of nature that wrecks everything in its path. I'll give you an example of what this looks like in real life. Imagine you're scrolling through Facebook or Instagram and someone who rarely posts suddenly turns into an armchair philosopher. They're posting daily about letting go, finding peace, and choosing themselves. That's controlled seepage, unconscious content making its way through the repression barrier, one inspirational quote at a time. It's a collection of aha moments being consciously integrated. But then, there's the other kind of post. User anonymous 123 #off my chest. I just realized I've been everyone's emotional punching bag my entire life. My husband cheated. He says it wasn't physical, but if you're hiding messages and deleting call logs, you're already in someone else's bed emotionally. And of course, now he's the victim because I overreacted. Typical narcissist move. Honestly, I should have seen it coming. I was raised by a woman who could have gaslit a fire, and then I married the same damn energy in a suit. I am just done. Done being the caretaker, done being the forgiver, the understanding one. Funny how everyone calls you crazy when you stop playing their games their way. It's not just him, it's all of them. My entire family is a parade of narcissists, enablers, and manipulators. I'm in therapy now. I'm setting boundaries. I don't even recognize myself anymore. In the best way. So yeah, maybe I'm angry. Maybe I'm finally seeing clearly, but at least I'm no longer asleep. #TMI, #sorry not sorry. Now, if you don't relate to either of these examples, then you probably aren't on social media, or you might be an internet troll. So let's take a look at how this dam works. The repression barrier is built from the ego's defenses. It forms the line between what we're consciously aware of and what we've pushed into the unconscious and acts as a buffer against cognitive dissonance. Denial, perfectionism, the stories we tell ourselves, curated personas, all of these are defenses we use to keep unwanted truths and emotional content at bay, especially when facing them would threaten our perceived sense of safety or survival. In short, they keep the unconscious unconscious. So what gets exiled behind this barrier? These aren't random traits. They're the very endowments we were given to carry, things we were meant to steward with conscious care. When those parts are forcibly stripped away bit by bit and relocated into places where we no longer have competence or authority over them, it leaves behind a wound. That wound becomes a fracture point in the repression barrier. Maybe it was your assertiveness. Maybe your ability to take risks or your instinct for truth-telling. What's taken varies by person, but there are also common cultural injuries, traits routinely exiled across society. And just like cracks in a dam, these fractures begin where something essential has been suppressed. These aren't meaningless traits either. They have ripple effects, personally and collectively, which is precisely why the collective reacts so strongly when someone's shadow content finally breaks through. A crack in the repression barrier makes people nervous, not because of the crack itself, but because of what it threatens. A crack suggests that the structure may not hold. There is a loss of control, and if it doesn't hold, then everything behind it, the secrets, the emotion, the history, The truth might come rushing out at once and destroy that carefully maintained image that has kept everything in place. Let's go back to the dam. A hairline fracture is enough to make an entire village uneasy. Not because the fracture is dangerous in itself, but because everyone knows what could happen if the barrier failed. In an instant, the landscape would be swallowed, homes, roads, sidewalks, gone under a wave of water no one could outrun. The fear is not the crack, the fear is the flood. And when that fear arises, it can quickly turn into an existential crisis. For example, if this is not what I thought it was, then what else might I be wrong about? Shadow energies aren't stronger by nature. They only appear more powerful relative to our shrinking conscious awareness. Every time we push down a trait, a drive, or an instinct because someone else told us it was unacceptable, we don't lose it. We lose our ability to relate to it consciously. Over time, the pressure builds, not because the energy itself is growing, but because of accumulation, avoidance, and the increasing complexity of the performance required to maintain an acceptable self. The more we exile, the more the pressure mounts. Eventually, something happens that touches the original wound. A betrayal, a word, someone not saying a word, and it sets off a chain reaction. This isn't just about the present moment, it's about the entire backlog of meaning stored in that fracture. The trigger reactivates the stored injury, and suddenly, what was repressed comes rushing back. This is the breaking point, and it's not random. It's a compensatory attempt to restore equilibrium, to bring back into view what was lost, all the way back to when it was first denied. And when the dam finally breaks, it's rarely graceful. Sometimes it's a 2 a.m. rage text to your entire group chat. Sometimes it's quietly ghosting everyone you love and calling it peace. This won't be the refined version of you, so it shows up in the same manner you'd expect it to, undeveloped and unskilled. It's either swinging too hard or collapsing in the corner. That's what we're getting into next, the two poles of the shadow, the active and the passive. One shouts, the other disappears. Both are attempts to survive the flood. Let's start with how people usually cope. When we're triggered, emotionally flooded, or overwhelmed, most of us respond by leaning into either the active or passive pole. These are survival strategies, not conscious choices. They're our way of avoiding discomfort, shame, or vulnerability when something deeper begins to provoke anxiety. The active pole orients externally. It expands outward. It externalizes discomfort and anxiety. It enmeshes. The passive pole orients internally. It contracts inward. It internalizes discomfort and anxiety. It withdraws. These poles are reflexive patterns we learned to survive, and they tend to provoke each other. The more one person chases, the more the other retreats. That push-pull cycle is polarization, where two people become locked in opposing roles, neither fully authentic, neither fully present, and that's why the pattern is so hard to break. Just because something works doesn't mean it's working. Underneath the poles is something even deeper: contradiction. Contradiction is what keeps us seesawing. It's when the self splits into black and white and tries to be only one thing at a time. Strong or vulnerable, pleasing or assertive, but not both. We first cling to the pole that feels most egocentric, the familiar one that matches our self-image, our familiar habits, or role we think keeps us safe. But when that preferred pole can no longer contain the pressure, when the repression barrier breaks, the unconscious bursts through the opposite pole, distorted, unfiltered, and oftentimes exaggerated. A self-doubter, embodying the passive pole, won't speak up because they are avoiding tension, shrinking themselves to stay likable. But when the pressure breaks, they flip, demanding reassurance, over-explaining, or emotionally flooding others in the name of being honest or transparent. On the other hand, a self-righteous enforcer, embodying the active pole, usually takes charge, offering guidance, correction, and direction. But when their influence isn't received, and someone sets a boundary instead of yielding, They don't push harder. They withdraw under the banner of, I'm done. Not because they don't care, but because withdrawing protects their image of authority while blaming the other person for the rupture. We see this all the time. Two people get into a totally chill disagreement online. One of them usually stays agreeable and avoids conflict. The other is known for speaking confidently and calling things out. They both say, it's not that deep, but now they're 4 paragraphs in. The quiet one suddenly starts rage typing, demanding to be heard. You know what? That's not okay. Meanwhile, the confident one starts deleting their messages and types in the word blocked. One flipped from bottling to dumping, the other flipped from control to cutoff. That's contradiction. The outside doesn't match the inside. Both are swinging from one pole to the other, giving themselves cognitive whiplash as they try to preserve the status quo, inhaling copium so that they don't have to bring up the issues that are really bothering them because it's easier to swing to the other extreme than face what's in the shadow. But until we hold both parts in conscious awareness, the teeter-totter keeps going. Paradox is what becomes possible when we stop treating opposites as enemies. Instead of choosing a side or canceling one out, we let both truths exist without rushing to fix the tension between them. Marion Woodman would call this balancing the tension of the opposites. If we can sit with the discomfort long enough, the tension itself begins to shape something new. That's not just a workaround or a compromise. That's transformation. Paradox lets you say things like, I feel hurt and I still want to stay in this relationship. I want to be understood and I recognize that I haven't always communicated clearly. I'm uncertain about what to do, and I trust that clarity will come if I don't rush it. These statements don't cancel out one side in order to validate the other. They hold both truths at once. Sometimes, when the ego and shadow sit down together, life reveals a third path neither side could find on its own. You don't kill one side to make room for the other, you integrate them. Robert A. Johnson says, to transform opposition into paradox is to allow both sides of an issue, both pairs of opposites, to exist in equal dignity and worth. End quote. This balance is what Robert Moore would call the archetype in its fullness. Its maturity, the ability to hold complexity without collapse or overreach, not swinging between control freak and doormat, but standing in the middle like you're oddly satisfied with your adulting performance today. Maybe I am a grown-up. The point isn't to be perfectly balanced every moment. It's to know what part of you is showing up and what that says about what's hiding in the shadow. And that's where shadow work begins. So let's go back for a moment and revisit what the shadow is. The shadow is not your bad traits. It simply holds whatever you aren't consciously relating to. It could be something that you did quite well yesterday, but the circumstances and the people today caused you to forget. Shadow material isn't rigid or compartmentalized. Marie-Louise von Franz says, it would be a great mistake, as Jung himself often emphasized, to suppose that the shadow, the anima or animus, and the self appear separately in a person's unconscious, neatly timed and in definable order. End quote. Rest in peace, personality typing. Turns out the psyche didn't read the workbook on the unconscious. Personality typing can be a helpful way to notice patterns, but von Franz reminds us that the psyche doesn't follow charts. The shadow, anima, animus, and the self with a capital S don't stay locked into neat little boxes. They show up wherever you're unconscious and usually not on a schedule. On top of that, most models differ because they are shaped by the system maker's psyche. The framework is never separate from the person who made it. For every complex problem, there's an answer that's clear, simple, and wrong. If someone gives you an easy formula for how your unconscious works, they're probably selling you something if it's not just straight up taking advantage of you. So what is shadow work then? You're not becoming someone else, and you're not layering on a new personality. It only feels unfamiliar because you haven't been relating to these contents consciously. Shadow work isn't about merging with the shadow or making it part of your identity. It's about recognizing what's been operating outside your awareness, taking responsibility for it, and learning how to relate to it with maturity. What emerges is not a new you, but a more aware you, one who can choose how to respond rather than being driven by what has been hidden. They call it shadow work instead of shadow play because, you guessed it, it's going to feel like work. The process by which you bring out your repressed contents to take an inventory is uncomfortable and anxiety-producing, but it's also straightforward. It comes down to 3 components practiced consistently: awareness, catching the reaction or trigger; honesty, naming the exiled or repressed part; and choice, deciding how to respond, not just react. Let's look at these components in a real-life example most people will either relate to or at the very least have seen online. We'll call it the selfie spiral. You're about to post a totally casual selfie to your story for the 5th time today, hoping he notices. That's awareness. You admit to yourself, okay, this isn't just me loving the lighting, I'm craving validation and I feel insecure right now. That's honesty. You save the photo to your camera roll and decide to text your best friend instead. She hypes you up and you don't spend the rest of the day checking who viewed your story. That's choice. So why do shadow work anyway? Why put yourself through that? There are all kinds of incentives for doing anything, but I want to highlight 2 key reasons why shadow work is important. On the individual level, it is what gives us moral clarity and self-acceptance. No longer do we have to live by the constraints that our family of origin, culture, fears, etc. tell us is unacceptable. We have a chance to look at our entire psyche without hiding or running away from it. We no longer have to limit our perception and can give ourselves permission to look at reality from our own point of view. We finally begin to see with our own eyes while also being informed by others. That's where the final choice comes into play, because we can become responsible for our impact on others. By doing this, we break the cycle of projection that affects each other interpersonally. That interpersonal impact is what fuels dysfunction and disorder at a societal level. Shadow work isn't just personal, it's cultural healing. We do it for ourselves with the knowledge that it will impact more than just ourselves. Here's an example of how one person's decision in a friend group can lead to a healthier overall dynamic. Kelly is the friend everyone trusts with secrets because she's always ready to listen and add her own opinions. When someone brings up a girl they don't like, Kelly jumps in with, "Yeah, she's kind of fake," just to stay included. She hates it afterward, but she also hates feeling left out. After starting shadow work, Kelly begins to notice how much of her gossiping is really fear of losing her friends. The next time the group starts tearing someone down, Kelly takes a breath and just says calmly, "I don't really want to talk about her like that." She doesn't defend the girl or lecture anyone, she just opts out. The group gets awkward at first, of course. One friend changes the subject, another teases her for being a goody-goody, but slowly the tone shifts. People start talking about other things. By stepping out of the gossip loop, Kelly changes the way the group connects. It's a single choice, but it shifts the whole system. Shadow work is learning to notice when these parts appear, giving them a seat at the table, and using what they reveal to make more conscious choices. That is how you start balancing that seesaw we talked about earlier and taking responsibility for what's influencing you, one choice at a time. If this all sounds inspiring, don't get too comfortable. Shadow work is fraught with its own traps. Engaging with what the shadow contains can wake you up, or it can suck you in. Let's look at a few of the most common temptations now. Spiraling into endarkenment is where a lot of people get stuck. If you're not familiar with that term, endarkenment, let me orient you using a term you are probably more familiar with, enlightenment. And when I say enlightenment here, I'm not talking about insight, growth, or spiritual clarity. I mean the popularized fantasy of a permanent, purified state of transcendence, the version where the ego claims to be all light, all aware, and therefore above the shadow. That is a polarized, inflated state. In that version of enlightenment, the dark isn't allowed to exist, not in you, not in anyone. Think of the classic cycle breaker, who suddenly starts airing all the family secrets. It's like turning on a bright light in a kitchen at midnight. Like a bunch of cockroaches, everything that's been hiding scurries to avoid being seen. Where enlightenment strives to identify with only the light, endarkenment strives to identify with only the dark and becomes more and more polarized into things deemed unacceptable. States of enlightenment and endarkenment are not integration. They are polarizations, swings to opposite extremes of inflation. Endarkenment is an intoxication of energy from the shadow. It's compelling because it feels powerful and addictive because it's effortless. Staying balanced and conscious takes work, but surrendering to impulse, that takes nothing at all. You just stop pushing yourself up with the discernment on that teeter-totter and bam, down you go. Get triggered, blow up. It's faster. Just give in to the rage. See something you want? Stare, scroll, obsess. Why not? It's natural. It's the path of least resistance, and that's why it is tempting. You're not choosing the drop, you're just not resisting it. And in that moment, that relief feels like empowered authenticity, but it's not. It's the psyche giving up and calling it being real. It feels powerful because you're not fighting the weight anymore. Just look at how the dark feminine gets glamorized online. Unapologetic, untouchable, dripping with that I don't care energy, but it's usually the same look. Scantily clad, sultry stare, selling the illusion that desirability and manipulative ability equals power. She's not actually powerful and free, she's stalling her own progress while convincing herself that's liberation. Endarkenment feels like emancipation, but it's actually reactive. It fools you in 3 ways, and this is of course not an exhaustive list. First, it gives immediate payoff but long-term bondage. A woman who is seduced into the dark feminine feels temporarily powerful because she can provoke desire, envy, or intimidation, but she's still chained to the reaction of others. Her sense of power exists only if others respond. That's not agency, that's dependence. Second, it's a fusion, not differentiation. Endarkenment whispers, I am my rage. I am my sexuality. I am the villain. That's akin to psychological possession. If you can't stop yourself from lashing out, obsessing, or manipulating, who's really in charge? Integration, on the other hand, keeps the energy, but adds choice. I have rage, but I decide when and how to use it. And finally, it turns into indifference instead of discernment. When you stop putting in the effort to choose, you stop caring. And it's all just, yeah, so what? I'm just trolling. Ban me if you don't like it. But that's not authenticity, it's emotional offloading. It puts all the onus on the people that person is impacting rather than expending the energy to take responsibility over one's thoughts and actions. You know all those posts going around that talk about, that emotional burden wasn't mine to carry. Endarkenment is the flip side of that. It hands your emotional mess to someone else, expecting them to react, pick up the pieces, or give you what you want without you doing the work. This is more than just bad manners. It's making a mockery of ethics. When you stop differentiating between what's acceptable and what's not, indifference starts to masquerade as a secure sense of self. But that's not real. It's using laziness to write off feelings of doubt. Jeremiah Abrams makes it clear in his book, Meeting the Shadow, when he says, quote, owning your shadow does not mean gaining enlightenment by banishing the dark, as some Eastern traditions teach, nor does it mean gaining endarkenment by embracing the dark, as some practitioners of black magic or Satanism teach. End quote. When you give in to endarkenment, you're letting the very energies you're meant to steward take the wheel. That's the essence of that psychological possession I just mentioned. When a thought whispers, do it, and you follow without ever asking, should I? You are not here to become the darkness. You are here to steward what lies within it. That's the difference between impulse and choice, being ruled by unconscious material and maturing through it. Doing shadow work takes more than just doing things. Anyone can follow steps, copy methods, or obey someone else's rules. That's just the same old chains in a new package. Real effort means stopping to ask, what is actually true for me? And am I willing to stand behind it? It's not just about recognizing what you feel, It's about testing what you believe to be right and wrong, knowing that you may discover that you are mistaken. That's the frightening part. Once you acknowledge your own standard, you are responsible for living by it. Most people avoid that because accountability means you can no longer hide behind other people's opinions, cultural scripts, or moral hand-me-downs. Shadow work asks you to risk being wrong in service of being genuine. But when you're in the dark, surrounded by the shadow and afraid to risk being wrong, that's when people get caught. You want to reach for a hand that looks like it knows the way, someone who sounds certain, someone who promises clarity, but not every hand leads you toward growth. Some are only leading you where they want you to follow. That leads us to another shadow temptation, the lure of false lights. A true mentor teaches you how to hold your own reins. A false one holds them for you and hitches you to their wagon so your effort helps pull them forward. False lights are not always malicious. Some are simply misguided. They may come from people who mean well but don't know better, or from cultural messages that sound empowering but lead us in circles. Others come from opportunists. Either way, the danger is real because your effort is real. And that effort you're making turns into you taking action which get you walking down the wrong path. You're trying, you're doing something, but it's being poured into an agenda and system that doesn't truly serve you. The effort is misplaced at best and exploited at worst. When you're desperate for clarity, any confident answer that tells you what to do can feel better than not knowing. Confusion isn't failure. It's a sign you're asking real questions. Feeling stuck in that discomfort zone can feel agonizing when someone nearby seems so sure. That's the lure. They know and you don't, or so you think. Not because you're incapable, but because you're in a state of not knowing yet. So you follow their guidance, hoping it leads you out of the dark. False lights don't actually offer clarity at all. They give you closure. It's not a conversation, it's a conclusion. One that says, stop asking. Closure feels like salvation when it's delivered by someone with a confident persona, a bulletproof method, and a story that sounds just like yours. But it's not designed to give you agency. It is designed to make you dependent. Life doesn't get easier because someone hands you a secret shortcut. It gets easier because you grow. You get stronger and you become more adaptable. You gain resilience from the challenges you've faced and learned from. There is no easy button. Which brings us to the trap. Confused people are easier to control, and the opportunists selling you that easy button know it. Every question you stop asking, every choice you surrender feeds their authority. You go in expecting transformation, but what you get is entanglement. There's a real hunger behind shadow exploitation in the form of a power complex. It's not enough for them to have followers, they want dependence. If you put enough of those dependents together in a group or community, something predictable happens. Approval becomes the currency of belonging. The group will tend to mirror the leader's judgments, using them as justifications to police each other. At that point, you're not just seeking the leader's approval, you're seeking the group's approval, because you've seen what happens to the one who questions the status quo. Dogpiling, humiliation, and exile become the enforcement system to prevent anyone from thinking for themselves. It's like a wolf herding a flock of sheep. The sheep believe the wolf is protecting them from danger, when in reality, the danger is internal. The threat isn't the outside world anymore, it's what happens to you if you step out of line. That's how people get sucked into cults and acquire a taste for the Kool-Aid. And let me tell you, it can be pretty strong. It isn't gullibility. It is the pull towards something that feels like an answer. They didn't want to be lost anymore. And what they found brought just enough false certainty to numb the panic and dull the doubts. Until one day it doesn't, and you wake up and you realize that this isn't healing or progress. This is someone managing you. Everything is just functional enough to keep you from noticing how the last vestiges of your autonomy are being usurped. And if something goes wrong, it's because you broke one of their cardinal rules, not because their system is flawed to begin with. You didn't just lose your way and you weren't suddenly powerless, you were steered off course by someone who knew exactly how to use your blind spots against you to protect their own sense of power. So how do you know it's not a trick or gimmick? A real mentor doesn't make you dependent. They strengthen your agency. They ask questions that help you clarify what you value, and they point you towards tools, resources, and relationships that support your own direction, not theirs. They don't need to mock others to elevate themselves, and that's not a small detail. That's actually a big red flag, because how someone talks about their peers says a lot about how they handle authority and how they treat the people who turn to them for help. If they need others to appear less capable, less knowledgeable, less evolved, it is only a matter of time before that same need shows up in how they treat you. When someone's identity depends on being the one with all the answers, your growth becomes a threat. Your independence isn't a success story to them, it's a loss of control, and often a loss of income. Here are a few questions to ask yourself to see if you're falling into this temptation of following false lights. Self-check number 1. Has someone made an enemy for you to rally against? A real mentor doesn't need a villain to validate their wisdom. They don't turn your healing into a crusade. They don't exploit your fear, they give you hope. Because unless you're literally in a war zone, there's no reason to keep living in someone else's battle, whether it's against your family, a political group, or their favorite scapegoat of the week. You are not cannon fodder. You're a free person, and it's okay to act like one. If you've made it to shadow work, it's because you have broken the chains and assumed constraints. You do not have to keep living by those same imprisoning beliefs and false constructs. Self-check number 2. Do they return you to your own discernment or make you afraid to think without them? And are you afraid of getting the wrong answer in their presence? Ask yourself the simplest question. Do I feel more free or more dependent? Real mentors don't want your loyalty, they want your growth. They guide you back to your own agency, not their authority. If someone needs you to stay small so they can feel big, they'll never want you to leave. If their help requires you to stay confused, loyal, or afraid, you're not learning personal sovereignty. You're learning obedience. Self-check number 3. Can you question them without consequences? Real mentors don't require blind loyalty or performative agreement. They don't punish doubt, disagreement, or the desire to think differently. Pay attention. Are you encouraged to wrestle with the truth, even if it means diverging from the group? Or are you being rewarded for parroting back the right answers and defending the cause? If speaking honestly costs you connection, approval, or access, you're not in a space of growth, you're in a system of control. The real danger isn't just being misled by others. It's outsourcing your judgment to someone who benefits from you not thinking for yourself. The more disconnected you are from your own lived sense of what's right and true, the easier you are to influence and then exploit. False lights count on that. They don't actually want your clarity, they want your compliance. They want you to be their living proof of concept, someone that they can point at and use to sell other people the same ideology. Learning to discern for yourself is what keeps you from circling someone else's flame just because it burns brightly. A true guide doesn't dim your shine or tell you what to think. They help you burn brighter and fly free. All right. Now we're at a point where I need to give you a trigger warning. This third temptation will contain topics related to violence and suicide. No matter how well someone does at following the rules that society dictates for success, some people will eventually find that despite their best efforts, something, some institution, or someone has failed them. It could be that they didn't get the love they needed from their parents, school wasn't quite set up for their specific personality, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time and putting trust in the wrong people led to disastrous results, and sometimes those consequences will stay with them the rest of their lives. When the pain from putting effort toward people and systems that let them down becomes realized, people will try to shift and adapt. If they can, they find new people and new places to believe and put their trust into. But what happens when something keeps them stuck? A person they love and something they believe in doesn't line up. Like when a woman holds the belief that a family belongs together, but in order to keep her family together, she would have to endure abuse. How long does she stay and endure before she has to make a decision that feels unbearable either way? I can tell you one main way the youth has decided to cope with moral dilemmas. Suicide has become the second leading cause of death for people aged 10 to 24 in the US, and it's the third leading cause among people aged 15 to 29 globally. Similarly, homicide is the third leading cause of death for the same demographic of 10 to 24 in the US, and a leading cause of death globally among people aged 15 to 29. These statistics, which you can find at the CDC and World Health Organization, reflect a deep crisis of meaning and the inability to sit with despair. We talked earlier about how, when we're overwhelmed, we tend to swing between the active and passive poles to avoid the discomfort of holding two truths at once. Holding that tension is hard. It takes a lot of patience. This burden can become debilitating for some, and so they search for a way out. The temptation to escape hopelessness through suicide, addiction, dissociation, projection, violence, or spiritual bypassing is a crisis of faith. Some people will tell you that being in that state means you lack faith or moral strength. If you just trusted God more, you wouldn't feel this way, but that isn't true. While it is true that despairing in God would be a moral failure, that is not what most people are experiencing, and not what I am talking about here. What they are experiencing is a despair in the false belief systems they have set up beside God. Studies show that suicidal despair is strongly associated with social isolation, family dysfunction, trauma, and chronic stress, not with theological disbelief. And sometimes, the people who shame you in that moment are not speaking from faith. They are speaking from fear. They need you to keep believing in the same systems they rely on. So instead of sitting with you in uncertainty, instead of really being there with you, they insist you just have more patience or trust harder, as if faith means overriding your own conscience. This is where spiritual scapegoating shows up, when someone uses religious slogans to avoid confronting their own fear or uncertainty at your expense. That state of despair is not failure. It is the threshold of transformation. The real temptation isn't hopelessness itself, but fleeing from that inevitable transformation. It's a deep restructuring of the rules you live by following a confrontation with information that seems new to you because it was unconscious before that. It is not a surface-level improvement or self-help glow-up. It involves breaking down inherited assumptions, suffering, confusion, and reshaping your belief system. This is why integrity of character matters so deeply. When we're in pain, we face a choice: to sit with it and allow it to reveal what lies beneath the surface, or to escape it, often by extending its impact. That extension might turn inward through self-harm or suicide, or outward through violence and destructive behavior. Robert Moore likens this threshold to the dark night of the soul, a moment when containment is crucial. But what does containment mean in practice? It is the act of holding space for what arises both inwardly and outwardly. Internally, you witness yourself without fleeing. Externally, another person may serve as a compassionate, non-intrusive presence, what Alice Miller, the Swiss psychologist who wrote The Drama of the Gifted Child, calls an enlightened witness. And beyond both, there is the ultimate containment, knowing that God bears witness. Even when no human support is present, the awareness of being seen by God can anchor us. This sacred containment keeps pain from spilling into unconscious action and reorients us toward the vertical moral axis, one that a person may never have been formally taught, yet is deeply known. Escape sabotages a person's personal transformation and keeps them cut off from their inner compass, because the chaos that ensues muddies the waters of awareness. The clarity derived from stillness and holding space is delayed or ultimately extinguished. Choosing not to escape is an act of moral courage. Real change shatters illusions. When you finally see the cracks in what you were taught about love, family, safety, or even God, it is not just an identity crisis, it's an existential one. Who am I if the people I trusted betrayed me? What is good if my culture got it wrong? What is sacred if authority used it to harm? Did others harm me? What have my own hands wrought? These are not abstract questions, they live in our bodies, and it is precisely this collapse that makes reconstruction possible. Think of a butterfly entering its chrysalis, literally turning into mush as its entire body is restructured. Marion Woodman describes this process. Quote, It's the twilight zone between three worlds, past, present, and future, the precarious world of transformation. Part of us looks back, part of us looks ahead with courage, and most sits still, not daring to look either way. The chrysalis is absolutely essential if we are to find ourselves. Nothing in our extroverted society supports introverted withdrawal. If we choose to just be still, our loved ones may assume we are doing nothing. But if I don't know myself, I cannot love myself. And if I do not love myself, my love of others is probably my projected need of their acceptance. End quote. When we're in this caterpillar stage, we consume indiscriminately. Beliefs, attachments, assumptions, etc. Like in the children's book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar. We keep eating. Ideas of success, validation, status, approval, family roles, beauty standards. Some of it nourishes, some of it makes us sick. But we're still hungry. Eventually, we find ourselves led to the cocoon. It's where you begin to reorient your inner compass. You stop borrowing your beliefs and start forging them in the fire of lived experience. And that's the key right there. You have lived experience to fuel your transformation. If you build a cocoon as a refuge to avoid discomfort, there can be no transformation. If you've been there or are there now, you will know that the transformational cocoon is not comfortable at all. Some people think escape is freedom. They run to avoid their unease. But running away from pain isn't the same as being free from it. Real transformation doesn't work that way. Although you might geographically create a physical distance between yourself and the people and systems that did you wrong, freedom doesn't come from getting away, numbing, or distracting. It comes from your inner transformation, from facing what hurt you, what shaped you, and what needs to change in your own life. It's harder, but it's what gives you direction and the knowledge of what intentional action is right for you to take or not take. You don't grow wings to escape. Freedom isn't running. It's rising to the occasion. I'm going to leave it at that for this slide. It's heavy content, especially if you know that place. It's literally where people's lives hang in the balance and a source of grief for many. Let's now move on to something lighter. The shadow doesn't just contain what we might call darkness. When people associate the word dark with the shadow, it's usually because something is hidden, not because it's morally corrupt. The shadow can hold our integrity, self-esteem, conviction, or other qualities that others might perceive as light. It's often personified as if it has its own autonomous will or intention, because mainstream takes on the shadow treat it like a sentient figure we battle or merge with. That's a false understanding. I want to clarify this now because when we look at the following quote, and even earlier ones, you'll notice how ideas of ownership and identification get woven into classic interpretations of the shadow. These interpretations often confuse what the shadow contains with the shadow itself. Keeping this distinction in mind is essential if you want to understand what the shadow actually is, a psychological container. But let's keep moving. Jungian analyst Robert A. Johnson says that, quote, curiously, people resist the noble aspects of their shadow more strenuously than they hide the dark sides. To draw the skeletons out of the closet is relatively easy, but to own the gold in the shadow is terrifying. It is more disrupting to find that you have a profound nobility of character than to find out you are a bum. The gold is related to our higher calling, and this can be hard to accept at certain stages of life. He goes on to say, some people may suffer a severe shock or illness before they learn how to let the gold out. End quote. This quote brings up the concept of projection. Projection doesn't only push away what we dislike onto someone else, it also distances us from what we find favorable. Hero worship, fixation on mentors, celebrity adoration, and romantic idealization all come from this, a longing to find in another what feels out of reach in our own lives. These qualities aren't possessions, they're trusts of the soul, meant to be developed through lived experience. When we project them, we temporarily outsource our responsibility for them. The attraction we feel isn't random. It's like a homing signal. What draws us to others is often the very thing we have been called to steward. Everyone is probably familiar with someone who's pedestalized their romantic partner and thought he was just Mr. Wonderful, or she just walked on water. And I say someone because, of course, that's not us, right? It's always someone else, not us. But anyway, that person is carrying a quality they haven't yet realized as something they are capable of. The young woman who seeks external validation falls head over heels over the first guy that calls her beautiful, somehow not already knowing that she's beautiful. The young man admires a woman's nurturing capabilities, not realizing that he carries this capacity within himself. We hand over these qualities again and again because we haven't fully embodied our lived experience. For whatever reason, insecurity, fear of authority, existential dread, we may create this fantasy that someone else owns, with all rights reserved, that thing we are meant to cultivate ourselves. We don't start off hiding our inner gold. We have to be taught, directly or indirectly, that showing up fully leads to negative consequences. When we learn that authenticity invites rejection or abandonment, we begin to associate visibility with risk. Over time, fear builds up and clouds our awareness of the qualities we've dropped into the shadow. A little girl plays near the water's edge, tossing her golden ball. Symbolically, it represents a natural spark, a gift she holds. One day it slips and sinks beneath the surface. She can't retrieve it on her own, but later in life she meets someone who embodies the very qualities she once lost. The encounter triggers awareness. It's not that this person helps her recover the gold directly. It's that their presence mirrors what she once consciously held. That reflection becomes the invitation to remember. Remember little Susie. Let's look again at her and also look at where her parents are coming from. Susie's assertiveness and creativity weren't nurtured, they were rejected. In lieu of the skills to guide her, her parents shamed and emotionally abandoned her. Growing up in environments shaped by neglect, scarcity, and physical abuse, they had learned to equate someone else's agency with their own subjugation. Their parenting wasn't truly authoritative, it was an authoritarian dominant system, rigid, fearful, and emotionally avoidant. When Susie showed natural initiative, they misinterpreted her emerging sense of direction as a power move rather than a bid for connection. She wasn't following their unspoken rules, the ones shaped by trauma that had been internalized over the years, and that felt destabilizing. Calling her too bossy to play with wasn't really about her behavior. It reflected their fear of being overpowered and their inability to recognize what healthy collaborative leadership looks like. In homes where individuality feels dangerous, even small acts of authority can be taken as rebellion. So Susie learned that directing would cost her connection. Her budding leadership qualities sank, and she began to let others take the lead. As an adult, this plays out in subtle but persistent ways. Hesitating to place an order or make a phone call, deferring big and small decisions to more assertive friends, gravitating toward strong leaders instead of leading herself. Even in romantic relationships, she may not realize she has the right to co-author her connection. But Susie is in luck. The psyche has its own kind of justice. We're drawn to our lost gold when we see others handling it, or mishandling it even. Eventually, her frog prince shows up, someone who embodies the leadership she buried. She finds his self-authority magnetic. In the best-case scenario, he encourages her to embrace her natural talents, but often he's more like her parents, threatened by her strength and unable to make room for her light. And so the pattern repeats, but this time Susie is older and more aware. She tries again to be accepted as she is, and when she's not, the cost becomes clearer. If her partner's sense of identity depends on her staying small, the relationship's growth will stall. She may leave, or she may stay, internalizing that message again, that authenticity leads to abandonment and reshaping herself to fit someone else's limits. Over time, that kind of self-abandonment erodes the spirit. What looks like compliance becomes another form of suppression. Sometimes what happens instead is that the pain of this repeated wounding brings the gold back into view. She realizes that leadership isn't just a trait, it's a responsibility she carries, a way she's meant to engage with the world. It is not something to hide for someone else's comfort. This time, she can choose differently. She can look for a partner secure enough in himself to welcome her presence fully, someone capable of building something mutual, alive, and grounded in shared respect. So what are some signs that your gold is hiding in the shadow? Assertiveness isn't the only quality that can be lost. It does bear repeating, though, that one sign is you defer too much authority and automatically assume dependence, even though you have avenues and capacity to be self-sufficient. Here are some more signs. You idealize romantic partners. You fantasize about being rescued or mentored. You have a fear of responsibility, accountability, or being wrong. You feel envious of others' qualities or perceived successes. You have a fear of rejection, abandonment, or vulnerability. You have a fear of being seen as special or doing better than others. You're magnetized by someone else's talent, leadership, wisdom, or beauty. You feel unworthy around people you admire. If any of these symptoms ring a bell for you, then you're not alone. Recovering yourself from cultural and subcultural conditioning is a human task that could very well take a lifetime. In order to get in touch with lost gold, we can do a simple mirror exercise. Usually, mirror exercises reinforce an external fixation on others because the intention is to seek the fantasy of a spiritual union, like a so-called soulmate or twin flame reunion, which are the ultimate self-aggrandizing psychological projections because nothing screams spiritual growth like reenacting your childhood trauma with a sexy stranger you met on Instagram. Am I right? Being seen feels amazing. However, the allure is so strong that it is very easy to fall into fantasy rather than reality. So let me guide you on how to take a look at yourself. When used responsibly and in a grounded fashion, mirror exercises can remove romanticized idealizations and help you obtain internal stewardship of the qualities you're becoming aware of. Take mental notes or physical notes on this and pause the video if you need to. This is what a mirror exercise is, broken down step by step. So step 1. Who is the frog prince? Identify the person who evokes the strongest emotional reaction in you right now. You don't need to tell them. This is your inner work. Write down or think about filling in these blanks. The person I feel most drawn to or affected by is, fill in the blank. The qualities I most admire or resent in them are, fill in the blank. Step 2. Name the golden ball. What you see in them reflects what you've lost. Now explore what seems to come alive in you when you're with them, or even just thinking of them. When I'm around them, it feels like I can finally stop. They seem to carry the energy of safety, adventure, romance, freedom, discipline, etc. What you're noticing may not and probably won't be something you lack completely, but something you once held and slowly let go of, whether from exhaustion, rejection, or fear. This is the golden ball, a quality that got dropped, either because it felt too heavy to carry or someone convinced you shouldn't hold it. So step 3 is hold the golden ball. And ask yourself, when did I first learn it wasn't safe to carry this trait? How have I abdicated this quality or handed it off to others? Where do I already carry a seed of this characteristic, even if it's still undeveloped or inconsistent? This is where integration begins, acknowledging what you projected. Integration isn't just about insight. It's about holding space for what arises after the realization. Once someone sees the gold they've abandoned, it's common to feel grief, like you wasted so much time, shame, not knowing why you gave it away, resistance or fear, I'm not ready or I don't want to carry that again, anger at others for having taken it or at themselves for letting it go. And basically, once these lost parts are brought back into awareness, the unconscious grip they've had on your choices and expectations starts to loosen over time. I want to make it very clear that this isn't a quick fix. Much like affirmations, you'll need to keep practicing your noticing and awareness until what was unconscious settles more comfortably into your normally perceived consciousness. With active practice, you can usually move through the most intense part of the process within 4 to 6 months. But if what comes up leads you into grief, especially grief over how or why you projected this quality in the first place, then it might take longer. And that's not a sign that you're doing anything wrong. Emotional healing isn't linear, and it rarely runs on a tight schedule. Think of it more like physical rehab after losing the ability to walk. It's not just healing the injuries, but retraining your system to move with strength and intention again. That's a way more fair comparison. Just like the princess in the fairy tale needed the frog to bring her golden ball back from the depths, we often need relationships to reflect the parts that have slipped out of our hands. But once the ball is returned, we have to stop kissing frogs and start using what's been given back to us. Not to please anyone else, but to live out our own calling. And hey, if the frog turns into a prince, that's awesome. But if he hops away, you still get to keep the golden ball. Let's look again at yet another aspect of projection. Not everyone loses their golden ball to neglect or fear. It could be the case that you are simply handed someone else's. Think of it like being thrown into a sport you never signed up to play. There are dozens of ways to play with a ball: football, soccer, basketball, golf. Each game has its own rules, its own way to win. Similarly, people handle the golden ball of potential in different ways. Some guard it, some share it, some use it to compete, but sometimes the game is forced. Imagine being drafted into a football match you never agreed to. You're suddenly the tight end, and the quarterback, maybe a parent or authority figure, has already called the play. The crowd is watching, the pressure is on, and you're expected to run with the golden ball, not because you want to, but because someone else can't, or won't, or because that's what they, whoever they is, says you should do. You're sprinting toward the end zone, carrying their hopes, dreams, and fears, while the 200-pound linebacker of reality barrels toward you. Sometimes you make the catch, sometimes you get tackled, but either way, you end up playing someone else's game. Parents who haven't reckoned with their own dreams and wounds may pass that burden onto a child, calling it hope, expectation, or even love. I just want what's best for you. Every generation of men in our family has gone to either med school or engineering school. I know that you will make us so proud. On the other hand, if a child's innocuous actions trigger a parent, they, the parents, may recoil out of a deep-seated fear that shows up in different ways. For some, it's the terror of confronting their own buried pain over lost gold. For others, it's the envy stirred by unmet potential, the unnerving sense that someone else is living or could live the life they want. A fragile ego cannot tolerate being outshined or the idea of becoming obsolete, especially when another's innocent uninhibitedness exposes their fear, loss, and scarcity mindset. Unable to hold that tension, the parent unconsciously transfers their own discomfort onto the child. What they see is not the child's lack of consciousness, but a reflection of what remains unresolved within their own psyche. And that discomfort is passed down and projected, disguised as discipline, tough love, or concern. Societies love to fragment and assign roles to people. In family systems theory, each role contributes towards balancing the energy and anxiety of the whole. I want to talk about two of those roles now, the golden child and the scapegoat, but there are other children's roles, such as the family mascot or the lost child. What's special about the golden child and scapegoat is that they are more obvious recipients of shadow content being projected onto them. The golden child, as you may guess it, gets the gold, and the scapegoat gets whatever's shameful. Neither role is inherently about the child. In fact, they can switch up at any time. A previous golden child can become the current scapegoat, and vice versa. The projection belongs to the parent or whomever is doing the projecting, which is sometimes reinforced by enablers. So when you hear things like, "You were the scapegoat because you had so much light," it sounds good, right? But it's also very self-aggrandizing. The truth is that everyone has a share of desired and undesirable traits, and we all struggle to use our will consciously and with moral character. That role doesn't mean anything other than playing a part in someone else's fantasy. So don't absorb the projecting person's internalized, envious belief that somehow you are above the fray and thus must be taken down a notch and spoiled. You become a target of an idealized projection because of your vulnerability and accessibility. Is it any wonder that a primary response of many people waking up to the dynamics of a dysfunctional family is to go no contact? They instinctually remove accessibility, especially while they are still in a vulnerable state of fortifying their own authentic self-image. Both the golden child and scapegoat carry a burden, and that's the burden of being unseen. The parental projection blocks accurate sight of the developing child. So instead of seeing the golden child's needs, they are taught to not have any needs at all, and to perform instead. The golden child is at risk of carrying on the external projection because they have been taught that they don't actually have needs or vulnerabilities, and thus nothing is stopping them from achieving perfection until the unaccounted for witness, their body, revolts against them. The scapegoat is unseen because they are wearing the projective identification of the parent. Like a costume or mask, they are forced to wear the parent's undesirable character traits like vindictiveness or pettiness. The child's actions are then distorted by the projecting person's own intentions and capacities. Boundaries are viewed as defiance, and autonomous action is seen as lashing out. We spoke earlier about balancing the tension of the opposites, so it's a convenient way to look at these dehumanizing roles as well. One child is lifted up to be a redemptive, godlike figure, and the other child is seen as subhuman and demonized. The way out of these seeming contradiction is to realize that neither are true. They are simply a figment of someone's imagination who is struggling to integrate reality. The child behind the projection disappears, but if you remove that projection, the child can be witnessed and appreciated for themselves. It needs to be said that having the ability to recognize projection, both yours and other people's, is a gift. It can feel like a slightly cursed gift, sure, but it's still a gift. Most people don't actually realize they're playing in someone else's fantasy football league. They're just trying to be a team player and all until they start waking up and realize the team colors are toxic beige and generational trauma. And not everyone gets to quit mid-game, especially kids. They can't exactly walk up to their coach or parent and say, "Actually, I think I'm more of a free agent this season. Would you perchance trade me to that team over there with snacks and stability?" And I can tell you what else is a fantasy. Expecting the crowd to go wild and give you a standing ovation when you finally walk off the field. They usually don't. They might even jeer. They'll probably pretend not to notice. No slow clap, no highlight reel, no commentator saying how brave you were for refusing to play a rigged game. You can expect silence as the issue is swept under the rug along with the other family secrets. But you'll know. If you've ever done it, you'll know how much it costs to leave and how much it frees you. Walking off with your integrity intact is a kind of victory no one else can measure. Football, or whatever sport you want to insert here for the metaphor of mind games, isn't just a game, it's a ritual. So is family, so is culture. When you think about it, why do people care so much about the outcome of a ball being carried across a line? Why do entire crowds, people who aren't even on the field, paint their faces, chant in unison, and weep when their team loses? Why do we pour billions of dollars into industries built on watching, judging, and analyzing people from afar? Tabloids are literally on almost every single checkout line. I will tell you why. It's because we're ritual starved. We crave meaning and belonging. We need a place to channel collective emotion, to act out myths of victory and defeat, loyalty and betrayal. Games, gossip, even family roles, they're stand-ins for something deeper we've forgotten how to do consciously. So when someone walks off the field, any field, they're not just breaking a rule. They're disrupting a ritual. They're stepping out of the myth everyone made an unspoken contract to play out. And that's why people react like it's sacrilegious. If you think about it like this, you'll understand the emotional investment. Think about it in terms of joining a prestigious team or fraternity. Everyone pretty much got hazed in, and it could be that they were woken up at midnight and swept off to some undisclosed location to participate in acts of absurdity, like streaking or sitting on a frozen block of ice, being laughed at or tested. Initiation into these ritual games always comes at a cost, and those who've paid the most will often turn against the ones who refuse to keep playing. No one wants to know that the humiliation and degradation they suffered in order to play that game was for a lost cause. Your parents' generation of abuse that got normalized, that was their hazing. The abuse you got, that was your hazing. That's the emotional hook into the collective projection, your sunk cost, if you want to look at it that way. So when you say, "This isn't worth it anymore" by walking off the field, you're doing more than refusing to play. You're insinuating that their ritual is unacceptable and another ritual is better, and that's where you're headed. out of the bucket of crabs and onto something else. Real ritual, conscious, creative, nourishing ritual is what helps us heal. It's what makes grief bearable and reinforces belonging. It doesn't require humiliation or conformity to initiate you. It invites you into awareness without sacrifice of self. So don't just leave the old game behind. Make sure that you also step forward into who you aspire to be. Because what's waiting isn't just the absence of dysfunction. What's waiting is ceremony that builds bonds without the bondage. Art that gives honorable form to what's been relegated to the shadow without devolving into some sort of histrionic spectacle. And ritual that revives the soul instead of reenacting the wound. And that's what we'll turn to now. I want to start off with a personal story of induction and hazing. When I was accepted onto my high school dance team in Texas, I'm going to date myself here, 25 years ago now, I was told to sign a covenant of ideals, commitments to uphold character, grades, discipline, and merit. One evening when I was least suspecting, I was picked up by varsity girls on the team. We called them Big Sisters, and they took us to a go-kart track. What followed was a rite of passage of sorts. They painted me up with the performance makeup, bright red lipstick, shimmering blue and gold eyeshadow, and blush so bright that you could see me if I was standing in the middle of a football field and you were as far away as the bleachers. No washed out faces on our team, I can tell you that. I had the most wonderful time. We played putt-putt, water games, those boats outfitted with water guns, and every so often we had to perform high kicks in public on command. I was too proud to be embarrassed. It was absurd, and it was bonding. No one explained why we were doing it, but it did something. It marked a transition. It said, "You're one of us now." No longer was I just a girl at school. I had transformed into a recognized dancer, a rite of passage. But not all rites and rituals stay so innocent. Sometimes hazing can become violent or fatal. Gangs use rites of passage to forge loyalty, but without moral containment, they are proficient at creating trauma bonds. There's not much going back when your sunk cost is either being jumped in or taking another person's life. What differentiates this is the abdication of conscience and morality. This human drive to ritualize is not about tradition. It is about maintaining equilibrium. Our minds and bodies are wired for homeostasis, a continual effort to stay balanced and stable amid change. When life shifts, and for example, we adopt a new identity, experience loss, or go through puberty, the body instinctively seeks equilibrium. As neuroscientist Diane Kelly puts it, quote, "The tendency of your body's tissues and organ systems to maintain a condition of balance or equilibrium is called homeostasis. Homeostasis depends on active regulation, with dynamic adjustments that keep the environment of your cells and tissues relatively constant." End quote. Emphasis on active regulation, that is the purpose of the ritual. Anyway, this balancing act is orchestrated in large part by the brain, especially the hypothalamus. But we are not just biological systems, we are relational beings. As Dr. Daniel Siegel puts it, we are mui, not just me as an individual, but we as interconnected minds. The mind, he explains, is an emergent process shaped not only within us, but between us. That means our drive for equilibrium doesn't stop at the skin. We seek balance in our relationships and our communities, and in the way we process life's major events. And that's where ritualization comes in. We give rites to respond to change, and what I mean by change could be birth, death, coming of age, even acceptance onto a dance team, right? Rituals help bind meaning to experience. They establish and maintain the structure after transitions and regulate emotion. They help us locate ourselves inside something bigger than our own personal chaos. But without moral guidance, that instinct to stabilize can twist. So I want to introduce you to the 4 T's of ritualization. The 4 ways rites and rituals direct energy toward personal and communal equilibrium. The first T is for transmission, the passing on of values, memory, role, or tradition through symbolic acts. The second T is transgression. Transgression occurs when the instinct to transmit is hijacked by compulsion or violation. It crosses boundaries without consent and conscience, often allowing the transgressor to reach equilibrium at the expense of the transgressed. It is also possible to transgress against yourself. Transgression is the source of righteous indignation. The third T is transformation, a fundamental change initiated through a rite of passage that supports internal communal balance. And lastly, the fourth T is transmutation, a coercive form of indoctrination. It mimics transformation but lacks integrity. There is no real synergy, only compliance at the cost of wholeness. It stabilizes a system by distorting a person, or distorts the system itself to accommodate one person or one part. These four T's constitute a barometer by which to judge the temperature of a communal system. Whether a rite or ritual heals or harms depends not on the act itself, but on whether it's governed by moral containment. Right action that honors both context and conscience. Moral containment doesn't emerge in isolation. It's inherited and refined through religion, culture, and family systems. These structures serve as the collective stewards of conscience, defining what is sacred and what is forbidden. This matters to our concept of the shadow because the impulses we act on or restrain are shaped by the ethical and moral boundaries we live within. A code, whether truly moral or merely conventional, determines what stays in consciousness and what gets rejected. When rejection is conscious, through what's called negative rites, the shadow's territory remains visible and held in awareness. Think, thou shalt not fill in the blank, kill, covet, steal, etc. Naming the prohibition keeps it conscious, even if the behavior is forbidden. Shadow is produced not by conscious rejection, but by secrecy. When an ethical tradition contradicts a deeper moral truth, the violation gets pushed underground. An unspoken rule develops. We don't talk about this. What is hidden becomes forgotten, and whatever is forgotten begins to rule from beneath our awareness. Just so we're all on the same page semantically, let's define a rite and a ritual. A rite is the ceremony, like a wedding or event that symbolizes the change from one state to another. No longer is he a bachelor, he's a married man. A ritual is an act that stabilizes that shift, like exchanging vows or giving rings. Rituals provide continuity to a ceremonial rite of passage, so that when that man decides to go out with his buds after work, he remembers the promises he made to his wife as a married man, and he even has a tangible artifact to look at on his finger to remind him of those promises. This maintains his transformation over time. Celebrating a wedding anniversary is another repetitive married ritual that renews that state of transformation of the married couple. The rite we are talking about here is spelled R-I-T-E, and that is not to be confused with R-I-G-H-T. When we don't properly understand what rite of passage means, we open ourselves up to the propaganda of distorted moral codes. For instance, the wedding night for a couple is another rite of passage. The act of consummation is not a rite, R-I-G-H-T, even though now it is morally permissible. The husband must still have the consent of his wife if that rite of passage is to be transformative rather than transmutational. The difference is this. With mutual consent, the husband and wife are no longer in a state of naivete about their sexuality. They get to discover a new side of themselves. Without mutual consent, one or the other, because this can go both ways, transmutates into something they are not, a position in a power hierarchy. That is not love, that's desecration, not only of the person, but of the ceremonial act itself. A rite is also not a delivery system for status or manufacturing worth. When a community treats a rite as a badge that grants superiority, or shames those who don't take that path, the rite becomes social control. For example, in some settings, a woman who doesn't choose motherhood may be shamed as less than. That is the rite being used as a status gate, a shift from reverence to rank, which is not aligned with morality. A true rite faces the center, our axis of morality, and simply bears witness. You have crossed a threshold. It does not crown you with superiority or strip another person of their dignity. When rights are bent toward ladders and ranks, they become tools of shame, mistaking transformation for entitlement and reverence for control. Roles are like garments we may wear: mother, wife, leader, monk. Identity is the person underneath, inviolable, meaning it can't be violated, only forgotten. A right may welcome someone into a role, but it cannot define their personhood. A community that remembers its center blesses those who enter a role and equally honors those whose path is otherwise. When a culture lacks conscious rituals for certain human experiences, like love, grief, rage, sexuality, awe, that energy doesn't just disappear. It looks for another way to manifest externally and consciously. That's where art comes in. Art is the shadow's heartbeat, pulsing through the collective imagination. It rises wherever something felt has nowhere else to go. And because of that, art has always been watched closely by agents of power. When the emotional life of a people threatens the established order, art is regulated, moralized, sanitized, or weaponized to preserve stability, or at least the appearance of stability. But whether it's celebrated or censored, art exposes what a culture is already acting out in everyday life, what that culture craves or fears, and what still feels too unsafe to overtly name. Art isn't just decoration. Every song, meme, mural, or stand-up comedy set is a performance of what a culture believes about itself. Dr. Ryan Eisler, a social systems scholar, says that, quote, "Art is a kind of language or shorthand symbolically expressing how people not only experience but shape what we call reality." End quote. In short, art symbolizes what we as a people ritualize. When a pop star comes out with a chart-topping breakup album, it's not just artistic expression. It symbolizes our romantic grief and detachment rituals. When the news cycle enters special bulletin mode over a political scandal that's come to light, it's not just a news story, it's a production. Satire, late-night comedy, memes, you name it. They symbolize our rituals of public execution. With moral containment, it can do quite a bit of justice and cleanse the political authority of corruption, which repairs public trust in the process. But when it's not morally contained, when no real standard has been violated and it's merely a power-motivated smear campaign, cancel culture can turn into a blood sport. Uncontained art recklessly awakens the shadow material in others. It baits the spectator as it devolves into exhibitionism, inciting an emotional reaction rather than a conscious, thoughtful response. It seeks power, forcing visibility, demanding reflexive or coercive participation, dragging others into its emotional gravity without their conscious consent. Contained art doesn't just express feeling, it sanctifies it. It channels emotion toward deeper meaning that aligns with a moral axis, transforming intensity into insight that improves perception. Uncontained art may feel significant, but it indulges rather than integrating the bigger picture. It creates a focal point that distracts, distorts, and can even blind perception. I'm not here to tell anyone what to believe in or what your art and rituals should look like. That's between you and your conscience. But I can say this with certainty: whatever form it takes, prayer is universal. It's how we slow down long enough to find a personal center and reconnect with something higher than our own will. In a world where rights are distorted and art is weaponized, prayer becomes a radical ritual act. It's the act that aligns you as closely as you can actually be to the moral axis. It's the greatest tool we have to make the unconscious conscious. So pray, because indeed prayer deters one from immorality and wrongdoing. That leads us to the last slide of our content for this presentation on the shadow. Now that we understand the shadow, how can we work with it? What do we do, right? There's not a lot of point in learning something if we aren't going to apply it. Learning should not be a way to avoid living. It's what enables us to live fuller lives. So let's get into the 6 practical tips to engage shadow content. I said it already, but I'll say it again. Number 1 is pray. Prayer isn't just some out there spiritual idea, it orients you, both within what you know and also within what's hard to know and accept. That orientation puts you in your place in the best way because it acknowledges that something greater than you not only sees you, but can contain your entire situation, regardless of whether or not you understand it. You can think of it like the effect a hug has on your nervous system. When a child is upset, its primary caregiver's embrace calms him down. Similarly, prayer contains you because your mind has to acknowledge that something is in control of what you cannot control. And not only do you have direct access to it, but it's got you. What makes prayer so powerful is that there is nothing between you and the Creator. No one can take it away from you or stop you. You don't need to find the right words, and you don't really even need to have words at all to label what it is you're feeling. You don't actually have to define any of that shadow content coming up. You can be a hot mess, completely cut off from people, and still be not truly alone. And that matters, because the reason shadow content feels so isolating is that it was buried for a reason. The threat, whether it was real or perceived, was that if you showed up in a certain way, you'd be rejected. And you would become unacceptable. But prayer breaks that story. It levels the fear because you're allowed to show up exactly as you choose to. So that's practical tip number 1, make sure you're praying. Practical tip number 2 is keeping an intense reaction diary. There is plenty of research touting the benefits of keeping a journal, but let's be real. Some of us aren't really Dear Diary people. It takes time, it takes discipline, and sometimes you have nothing to say. I used to keep journals. There was a time in my life when it really helped me identify what I was thinking and feeling. So this is not to say that I'm against the concept at all. I'm just saying that some is better than none. And if you really want to target the shadow, keep a specific kind of journal that you use only as needed. It's called an intense reaction diary. When something happens and it feels intense, or maybe it affects you longer than expected and it seems like more is going on than just what's on the surface, that's typically a sign something from your shadow is activated. It's worth taking a few moments to write it out. I prefer using a digital platform because it's quicker for me than pen and paper. I do like to use ChatGPT, but with stories coming out about how sycophantic it can be, making sure your prompts are geared toward understanding yourself and not psychoanalyzing others, so it doesn't turn into an us versus them echo chamber. AI at this point still cannot diagnose or treat anything, so if you notice your journaling keeps heading into darker territory, please reach out to a real live human being. There's a free international site called findahelpline.com. That's findahelpline.com. It connects you to support services in your country and someone to talk to or message with. I'll also put the link in the description box below. And of course, if you don't want to use a chatbot, you can use a Google Sheet, a notes app, or just a physical notebook. Some people really love the feel of pen on paper, and that's a beautiful way to engage with your process too. There's a method you can follow to examine the situation that you feel intensely toward. It's called the ABC model. A stands for antecedent, what happened before your B behavior, and C stands for the consequences of that behavior. Let's go back to A now. When we engage with shadow material, A is not just what happened in relation to the current experience, but oftentimes we react strongly because there is something in our history that's being related to. There's a pattern playing out. So for instance, if your partner ignores you and you get mad or hurt or shut down, it might not just be because he ignored you. Did he ignore you and that reminded you of your familial history of emotional abandonment? That's examining the antecedent. Ask yourself the question, what happened before you reacted? What sparked that situation? And keep in mind, this can include thoughts and bodily sensations, not just identifiable external events. Now moving on to B, the behavior. In response to him ignoring you, how did you behave? Were you in a stress response state, like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn? Did you shut down, close off, or withdraw emotionally? Did you confront him about it? Did you pretend like everything was okay? When we move out of our window of stress tolerance, we can become hyper or hypo aroused. It takes conscious practice to manage our actions within that state. When dealing with the shadow, we aren't looking at the behavior to shame it, we are looking at it to become aware of it. The anger, the fear, all that may very well be justified. C stands for consequences. What happened as a result of your reaction? Your partner ignored you, you withdrew emotionally. You fled the situation because it was painful. Nothing gets resolved, and there is no clarification from your partner about why he ignored you. The consequence is that the pain stays with you, unmetabolized, and it blends with previous hurts. That feeling that you just don't matter sits in your body and on your heart. The purpose of the intense reaction diary is to bring awareness to the shadow aspects compelling your behaviors so that you can determine how you want to align your behavior going forward. We can't change the past, but we can prevent certain actions from happening through internal boundaries. Going with our example, that may look like making sure we have our partner's undivided attention before we say anything. In rarer, more severe cases, it may mean no longer choosing partners that use silence as a weapon. We can also choose to behave differently. Instead of running away, we can clarify the situation by using Socratic questioning. Ask your partner, "Did you hear me?" Or, "What kept you from responding?" Sometimes we are not privy to information that could change how we feel about what happened. Maybe they didn't hear. Maybe they responded, but they accidentally muted themselves. Getting more data can inform our reactions to match more closely the situation at hand. This is what changes outcomes, breaks cycles, and leads to different consequences. For someone who habitually moves into a flight pattern, learning how to have difficult conversation helps to maintain emotional closeness and intimacy. The discussion gives the couple the opportunity to clarify and repair the connection and challenge assumptions. It also can help bring up more shadow content. I'll share an example with you because I recently experienced this with my husband. We stopped by a pizza place after going to Fright Fest at La Ronde, which is part of the Six Flags amusement park franchise in Montreal where we live. I took the kids upstairs to look for seating, and I did find lots of seating, but it was cold. So we came back down to wait on the pizza and found spots at a smaller table. And I told my husband that I didn't want to sit up there because it was too cold. Now, when our order was ready, the pizza guy told my husband something, and my husband looked at me and nodded for us to go upstairs. I immediately said to both of them, "It's cold," and I made it clear that I didn't want to go back upstairs. I wanted to eat where it was warm. Over the entire next week, I felt myself withdrawing. In my mind, I was hurt because I had made it clear that it was cold and uncomfortable upstairs, but for some reason, my husband had decided that something the pizza guy told him was more important to him than how I felt. That particular pain point triggered my own personal history of people trying to push my boundaries and ignore my needs because my feelings didn't matter, and not only that, but someone else's feelings mattered more, and I was not a priority. It took me about a week to finally ask, "Why did you tell us to move upstairs when I had already said it was cold up there?" And then my husband said that the pizza guy told him that that place we were at, since we were downtown, had some customers come in that might not be on their best behavior since it was getting late at that location. Of course, I was relieved that my husband wasn't just putting someone else's comfort above his family's, but I went a whole week thinking that he wasn't prioritizing us because past hurts were coloring my thinking. Either one of us could have clarified right there at the pizza place that maybe it's better to just leave with the pizza than to stay downtown that late at night. But we didn't. And that's how we learn to adjust our behavior in the future. He could have made me aware of the situation that the pizza guy made him aware of, or I could have asked. But because I was already hurt, I withdrew, and the consequence was that instead of understanding what was happening, I stayed in that place of hurt for a week. So bringing this back full circle, I can change the A, the antecedent. After we talked, we now just know that dining in with our kids downtown at that particular place should probably just be avoided in the future. While it was nostalgic for us because that was our old stomping ground while we both attended university, things are different when you have kids in the picture. As for my B behavior, I can clarify the situation sooner. It would have saved me the consequence of a week of hurt and misunderstanding. So moving on. Number 3 is your classic pros and cons list. This is a super simple way to look at the things you are projecting onto other people. Start by making 2 columns. In the first column, you write the names and attributes of the people you admire most. So-and-so teacher from 2nd grade was so kind. Write that down. Your coach from XYZ sport was such a talented motivator. Write that down too. Whatever qualities come to mind, compassion, creativity, leadership, write them down even if you don't have a name to attach to it, because after you make this list, you might notice those traits show up in people you gravitate towards. These aspects are likely found in your shadow and help define what's projected into idealizations of other people. In the second column, write down the names and traits of people you can't stand. Maybe it's that person online is so cruel, or that influencer is so full of themselves. These reactions might feel morally justified, and maybe they are, but they also reveal something about your inner framework, what you believe is right or wrong, and what you would never want to do with your free will. These aren't just judgments of the other person, they're projections of your possible potentials. Not because you would do those things, but because you could. The capacity exists within you. Even if your values steer you in a different direction, shadow work isn't about labeling yourself as bad. We don't want to fall into the temptation of endarkenment here. It's about realizing that no human being is above the potential for harm given the right or wrong conditions. Knowing that doesn't make you bad, it makes you self-aware and safer to be around. So the first column, column A, shows you traits you'd like to recognize and embody. The other, column B, shows you traits you try to reject or suppress. These lists are not intended to idealize, shame, or moralize. You may feel very differently about them in 10 or 20 years, but right now they offer a snapshot of your internal compass. They help bring your beliefs, fears, and aspirations into consciousness so you can choose how to interact with them, rather than let them project outward onto others without awareness. Practical tip number 4 is to sleep on it. One thing the shadow reliably enables is impulsivity. When its content constellates in you, it can override your rationale without you even realizing it. You then might feel pushed to act, speak, or decide quickly when in reality something unconscious is driving that urgency. That's why one of the most effective ways to engage with the unconscious is to slow down your decision making. Give yourself permission to take time. Let me sleep on it isn't just a polite delay tactic. It's a way of reducing time pressure so you can think more clearly and recognize how you actually feel. Let's say someone invites you to an event the day after you already have another one scheduled. You might feel torn, because here comes FOMO. You really want to go, but you also know you'll be drained. Instead of saying yes on impulse, give yourself space to think. Maybe the earlier event can be rescheduled, or maybe it can't. And you need to protect your energy. Sleeping on it helps you discern what's realistic, and it also sets the expectation with the other person that your answer won't be automatic. Or maybe someone sends you a message that triggers you emotionally. You want to respond right away, but that conversation might take a toll. Sleep on it. You're not obligated to reply instantly. Instant messaging is a convenience, not a leash. And when it comes to deeper relational conflict, especially with a partner, it is okay to go to bed without resolving everything. Despite the common advice that you should never go to bed angry, research shows that sleep deprivation actually leads to worse outcomes for couples. It reduces your ability to regulate emotions, makes negative feedback harder to process, and raises cortisol levels, making it harder to access empathy or good judgment when it's most needed. In short, time gives your consciousness a chance to catch up with your unconscious reactivity. So sleep on it is practical tip number 4. Tip number 5 is don't take the bait. If you've ever heard the phrase, "not my circus, not my monkeys," then this is exactly the concept behind don't take the bait. What it means is that when someone else has a problem, it doesn't have to become your problem. Their issues are not your issues. You can keep scrolling. It's also been said in a different way. Your crisis is not my emergency. Because not all bait is rage bait. Sometimes it comes off as, "please help poor pitiful me," and people who cannot regulate their own emotions or problems will depend on others to do the regulating and fixing for them. People stuck in unhelpful patterns have a tendency to hook people into circular and bad faith arguments because they are not aware of how compelled they are by their own unconscious values and beliefs. They will fight tooth and nail to ease any sense of cognitive dissonance. But this is not your problem. This is something coming from their shadow, not yours. If you can see that someone is using cognitive distortions, baiting, fallacious thinking, then that's your clue to let that wave crash on someone else and let it go straight past you. Just because someone says something you disagree with doesn't mean you need to explain it to them. When you consciously decide not to take the bait, you're doing shadow work. Because to resist the pull, you need to differentiate yourself, to hold firm in your will and say, this is not about me. That kind of internal clarity doesn't happen overnight, it takes practice. It's easy to get pulled into a fight you're passionate about, especially with strangers online or in repeated patterns with people you know well. Harriet Lerner calls this ineffective fighting because it actually keeps the status quo in place. We think we're challenging the system, but really we're playing out our roles over and over again. Many of these roles live in the shadow, but they're not always as explicit or consciously chosen as something like bus driver, where you have a clearly defined role with a uniform schedule and job description. You may not even realize you're playing a character. A simple example is until you've heard the terms golden child or scapegoat, it's just an unconscious way of being. That's where the feeling comes from when someone says, that put into words something I've known and felt for so long I just didn't know how to say. That's when you know you've just shone a light directly onto something in your shadow. That's what makes don't take the bait such a powerful practice. You're not just avoiding someone else's projection, you're confronting the part of yourself that once survived by stepping into roles you didn't choose and learning how to step out of them. Last but not least, we have practical tip number 6. Robert Moore, in one of his audio lectures, said, "If you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your parents." End quote. By the time you leave, you'll have a pretty good sense of the task you need to work on. It might be boundaries, not shrinking for acceptance, showing up without abandoning your own values, not getting triangulated into the family dramas, learning how to hold your tongue. Your family holds the seeds of your shadow's origin story. While it's very tempting to start blaming your family for your issues, and there may be real hurt to name, in reality, 9 times out of 10, they've inherited generational trauma the same way you did. Blaming a single dysfunctional parent may feel emotionally satisfying for a while, but it won't free you from the gravitational pull of shadow material. Now, I will say one caveat to this so that we're all on the same page. If you have an abusive family member and estrangement is for your safety, then this is not a call to put yourself in danger. That's why I said 9 times out of 10. There is a percentage out there that exists where going home for the holidays or spring break is not going to be an option. And if that's the case, then instead of spending a week with your family, go travel and take a vacation with your friends. Something will come up that will point you toward your task. What do you hide from them? What do you become rigid about? What rules do you try to implement to make it more comfortable for everyone? Who you are when you are with the people you are most intimate with will reflect back what you're still working on. Even if you make mistakes, you then have the opportunity to choose better. And that's one of the goals of shadow work, to be the one holding onto the wheel and driving in the direction you want to go, not being driven by unconscious impulses. Shadow work isn't about fixing yourself. It's about facing yourself, and that takes time, patience, and a lot of courage. The tips I've shared here aren't meant to make you a flawless, floating, illuminated being. That's not the goal. If anything, the point is to notice when you think you're being one, because that's usually when something from your shadow is already in the driver's seat. These 6 practices are tangible and simple on purpose. Prayer, a reaction diary, a pros and cons list, sleeping on it, not taking the bait, and spending time around the people who built your early nervous system. The shadow is practical and subtle. You notice it in the half second before you send the text or don't, before you react or don't. The point isn't to never have a shadow. The point is to stop letting what's hiding in it run your life. That's integration. It's not glamorous. It's just much cheaper than an exorcism. The shadow doesn't ask you to reject or accept anything. It can't ask you anything because it's not an entity. It doesn't have its own personality. It is a container for unconscious content. It contains what you've already rejected or accepted without you realizing it. It is not an enemy of truth, but what you think you know is only a drop in the ocean. And that's the lesson that having a shadow teaches you: humility. Shadow work is the labor of waking up to your assumptions, your projections, and your inherited moral codes. It's not for the faint of heart, and that's why so many people choose not to do it. In fact, not only do they not examine their shadow, they don't even examine the things they're aware of. Rare is the person who questions themselves and holds themselves accountable. In Ion, Jung writes, quote, "No one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort." End quote. The only way to move through this world with any real stability is with integrity, rather than superficial performance. You will always feel that void or like something's missing until you take care of your soul, and when you begin to do that, you will feel it in your body, your emotions, and in the reactions from the people around you. If you are curious enough to have gotten this far, then I do believe you are courageous enough to continue on this path. Guidance comes to those who are willing to seek it, and willingness itself is rare. We don't get to choose our starting point, what family we're born into, how we were raised, or our genetics, but we do get to choose how we give ourselves dignity right now. How you choose matters more than you realize. Grace isn't random. It arrives as help for those who strive toward what is right. Indeed, God does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. Thank you so much.